I think for a lot of people outside of Florida, and in fact, a lot of people inside of Florida, when you say Cuban America or Cuban American, your mind goes immediately to Miami, right? And for good reason. Pop culture tells us that's the center of all things Cuban American. Scarface and other material, music, Gloria Estefan, food, Versailles restaurant, all tell us that's where Cuban American things are, where the culture is, where the people are, la gente. But if you talk to our guest today, Sarah McNamara, you're going to find out that the Cuban American ancestry, the Cuban American culture goes far beyond Miami. In fact, it's far older than, say, post-Fidel, post-revolution, post-1959 Miami. And we're talking today actually about her new book, Ybor City, Crucible of the Latina South. In that book, she's talking about a very specific area, a town founded in the late 1800s by Cuban emigres into Tampa that really becomes the first site of the Cuban American experience. And to talk to Sarah, you get to talk about her family's ancestry, her family's history, and what amounts to a love letter to Ybor City, to Tampa, to the Cuban American community. And we're going to talk about this through a film that maybe a lot of you don't know, 2016's Live by Night. It was directed by Ben Affleck, starring Ben Affleck and a slew of others, Zoe Saldana, Chris Messina, Chris Cooper is in this film. It's a movie that should have been great that wasn't. And typically here on HATM, we try to do the big movies that you know. Maybe you don't know this one, but we came to this because it shows Ybor City during Prohibition, and it offers us the opportunity to talk about the diversity of the Cuban American experience, the Cuban American people here, the people of Cuba, people of the United States, but also the people who inhabit both of these worlds, specifically in Tampa. And Sarah's book talks so much about the establishment of Ybor City, talks about the people, the changing atmosphere, racial attitudes, labor, gender, through decades of the late 1800s, all the way up into mid-20th century and beyond. And we talk about all of that today. We talk about the differences in the Cuban American diaspora, differences between Cuban Americans in Tampa and Ybor City and Miami and maybe even New York and New Jersey and elsewhere. Did you know there's a Cuban community in Kentucky? There is. And we're going to talk about it today. This is one of my absolute favorite podcasts. Sarah is a new friend who I am so excited about her work. I cannot recommend this enough. So I'll put the book in the show notes, but I don't want to waste any more time. I want to get into this movie, but I want to get into this book, and I want you to get into this city because talking about Ybor City is fundamental to talking about Florida, talking about the United States, and talking about the world that we live in. So I think you're really going to dig this conversation. I had the best time talking with Sarah about it, and I think you're really going to like it. So sit back and relax, because Live by Night is next on the Histories of the Movies podcast. Hi, Sarah McNamara. How are you?
Hi, Jason. I'm doing well. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so happy. Like, okay, you and I have been talking about doing this pod for a little while, and I've been so excited. And we been going back and forth on movies. We were gonna do Live by Night, and then we're like, let's do Magic Mike because no one's ever heard of Live by Night. And then, like last night, I messaged you. I'm like,
let's do Live by Night.
And then we're like, let's do both. I don't care, because the reason young people who are listening and the olds who follow are like this. Like, in this, I swear to God, this is the first time I've ever actually held the book up while doing this pod. Because I love this. Ybor City. Oh my gosh, your new book. Ybor City, Crucible of the Latina South. I have so many reasons to tell you how much I love this book, and all I want to do is like talk about Tampa and Ybor and your scholarship, and then I guess also maybe these movies. I don't care.
I'm so glad. I'm just so glad you're excited. Last night when I saw you tweeting about it and you said that you liked the writing, I was like, that was one thing. I wanted you to feel like you were in Ybor. Like I wanted you to feel like you were in Florida. So I was like, yes.
I love the writing. And I was texting a friend of mine. His name is Kent Weber. I went to Minnesota with him. And he's incoming professor at Michigan State. And he did immigration history. He worked with Erica Lee when she was at Minnesota and all that. And I'm like texting Kent back and forth. And I'm like, dude, you've got to get this book on your syllabus now. He's like, what? I'm like, this book has everything, and it does, right? So I'm reading, I mean, you've got obviously immigration, right? You've got American history, you've got regional history, you've got gender, you've got crime, you've got prohibition, like this idea of womanhood, which takes this as center stage, and Latinidad. Oh my gosh, I am like, this book has so many. So one of the things I want to talk to you about today is like, how the hell do we teach this thing? Because I want this book in like every classroom. Like, para siempre. Am I saying that right? Por siempre? I always get my por and para mixed up, so forgive me.
Don't worry about it. It can take you back to the lessons of early, right, learning Spanish. So por y para. But don't worry about it. You're good.
I actually...
Everybody knows what you're saying.
French.
You're great.
Okay, good. Oh, yeah, because they're like, you're trying. Go ahead. You know, did you know there's a Cuban community in Kentucky? In Louisville?
I did not know that. No, I did know that. It's connected to the horse racing industry, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes.
I think they call them Kento Cubanos or something like that. Kento Cubanas. I think I just read about this like a year ago. I was like, what the? Because if you see me tweeting, like whenever I have to leave my beloved South Florida, the first thing I'm complaining about is my lack of Cuban coffee. Because I cannot get that anywhere else.
It's not something you could get. I was walking in Washington, D.C. with my husband a few months ago, and we saw this shop called Colada. And I kept seeing people post about it, and I looked at him. I was like, we have to go get some. And he's like, don't do it. You're going to be upset.
You're going to be disappointed.
You're going to be disappointed. And I walk in and I look around. I'm like, well, the pastries don't look right, so let's skip that. But I did get a café con leche, and I got a cortado. And the espresso wasn't right. But, you know, they were trying, I guess. It's hard to get outside of Florida and to do it well. But you can order Naviera coffee, and you can make it yourself well in your kitchen. I
have a trip to like Georgia like next week, and I'm not kidding. I'm bringing my espresso maker and like all my coffee stuff, because I make like this huge thing every morning that's designed to give me a heart attack, and because I will not go without my Cuban coffee.
That was one thing while doing the book and doing some interviews with people, is how many different ways I had café con leche made by people who were within the community. And my favorite ones, which are so awful for you, were the people who I would interview who would serve it to you made with sweetened condensed milk in some form. And I mean, it was excellent, but so awful for you, but still so good. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we were just talking off screen, right? And off screen, off camera, well, whatever, in the real world. And that was like, maybe I was telling you, I dated a woman of Cuban ancestry for about a year, and her great contribution to my life was teaching me how to make real Cuban. I mean, and this took multiple times where I would like get the sugar, because I'd make like a colada, and like it's all about like getting a few drops of coffee into the azúcar and then smushing it around and getting into this perfect whip.
Yeah.
And now I'm like, it's not as good as like the real stuff, but I'm very proud of it. That's my little thing.
It sounds good to me. It sounds like you're doing a good job.
I drink way too much of it. Like, it's like I have this much. I was talking to actually a friend of mine. Do you know Evan Bennett? He's at Florida University.
I do know Evan. Yes.
Okay, so he would be a mutual friend. He's from Tampa as well.
Yes.
And I was talking to him one day, and I was drinking coffee. He's like, "What are you doing? That's too much. You're gonna kill yourself." Because I had like this much. So. Okay. Anyway, all right. So for people who like are not into coffee, this would be my friend Eladio Bobadilla, who's at who's now back on Twitter and constantly complaining about this. But like, maybe we should talk about you and our and everything else. So Sarah, let's start with the basics. Sarah, who are you and like what do you do? Like introduce yourself to the HATM podcast audience.
Sure. Hey everyone. So I'm an historian. I study the modern US, so 20th and 21st century US. I focus on immigration, Latinx histories, women and gender, and labor in the 20th century United States. I am originally from Tampa, and my family is from Ybor City. So writing this book evolved over time and in many different ways, but one of the things that I always wanted to do was to write a book that I felt like my family could understand and that the community I'm from could relate to, and to also introduce Ybor to a larger national audience and to talk about Florida as more than a place that was exceptional. And there's so much about understanding the state and about understanding Latinidad within the state and understanding why Florida is how it is that I feel like lives within this story. But we don't often, there's so little scholarship on Florida, which is a strange thing, but a very real thing. And there's more assumptions about what it is. So, and even when we as historians write about Florida, talk about historians in Florida, tend to talk only to each other within the context of Florida. Somehow, those who write about Texas have managed to like amplify themselves in a way that Florida never has, even though it has this longer history. So that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to introduce Ybor to all of us beyond the state and all of us beyond just Tampa and show why the story matters.
So I have to tell you, I'm so excited that you wrote this book. I have my own kind of unique tie to Ybor, which I told you about, and I'll talk about this in a second. And I think you were just absolutely right and so on the head. So as I'm reading like into your book and listening to you talk about all these differences about Florida, I'm like, you get it. And I'm so excited because I think Florida outside of Florida for so many people exists as like this weird like Florida man thing. And like you see me playing around Twitter, I kind of lean into it a little bit, but it doesn't get into the diversity of the state. And for whatever reason, I feel like, and this goes all the way back to say maybe the colonial era, because if you go back into there and you talk about this in the book about, you know, you write this beautiful line about how Florida is and has always been native land first and foremost. And I was like, yeah.
I will give a hard shout out to my best friend, Liz Ellis, who read and reread and reread that first section to be sure I got it the way that it was.
Okay, I know Liz just a little bit. Because we work in the same kind of world. She's brilliant.
She is.
Oh my god,
she is.
She's so scary smart. Like I read in there you talk about her being your best friend. I'm like, I want Liz Ellis to be my best friend. I want Liz Ellis to read my. Oh my gosh, she's amazing.
She's unbelievably patient, and she knew what I wanted to do with that first section. And as I was writing it, I mean, she's read more versions of this book than anybody else has. But we spent so much time talking about how to set the stage of what I wanted to do within the book. And yeah.
Well, I wonder, okay, I want to jump into that in just a second. But before we do, I need to ask you the single most important question here.
Yeah.
Coke or Pepsi? What do you got?
Oh, Coke. Coke is my favorite.
Oh, good. We can continue this podcast. That's good. All right.
It really would be cherry Coke if I were to make a choice.
Oh, you can totally make that choice. Mm-hmm. But you're currently in Texas now, right?
I'm currently in Tampa at the moment, but I live in Texas. Yeah.
Right.
I work in Texas.
You can fall back on the Dr. Pepper thing because they're hardcore Dr. Peppereños. I don't know how we would say a Dr. Pepper fan in Spanish.
I mean, it wasn't until yesterday that I even knew there was a Dr. Pepper museum in Waco.
Oh, for real?
Yes.
I didn't know that either. Because there's only one. Yeah. There's only one soda museum. It's in Atlanta, and it's the Coke one.
It is.
So, yep. And I'm going next week.
Love it.
It's my quest to get diabetes. I don't know. I wonder. No. Okay. So to go back there to talking about Liz for a second, we'll just wildly depart onto her. But you wrote this as your doctoral dissertation?
Yes, this was my dissertation, and I am one of those people where, you know, there is that saying out there where you have a done dissertation and you have a publishable dissertation. I had a done dissertation. There is nothing really between the book and the dissertation, not even words. It is a completely rewritten manuscript, which, I'm not sure I recommend that to people. It was quite the haul. I didn't save the organizational pattern. The storyline is completely different.
Wow.
I am that person who fully rewrote the book. And on the tenure clock, it was an anxiety-inducing experience.
I wondered about that as I was reading your book last night and this morning, because the way the book reads, to me,
it didn't read like that as a dissertation.
Well, yeah. I had wondered, right? I wondered if maybe the dissertation was more clinical. And here's what I mean.
Yeah.
Because I'm reading your book and it feels like a love letter to this community. That's what this book feels like to me. As I'm reading it, it's so intimate and so personal. And you're using these family histories to introduce the reader into this amazing community. Comunidad? Is that really the right word?
Yep. Comunidad. Mm-hmm.
That most people I would expect outside of Florida are probably unaware of. Ybor City, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we think about LA, right? And we think about the work of like George Sanchez, who's introduced us to Boyle Heights. We have Natalia Molina, who like recently writing about her family and, restaurant industries. We know about LA. We know about vast regions of Texas. So many histories of those who are in, especially the Puerto Rican diaspora in New York, much less on that in Orlando. But I wanted people to know about this because we speak about Cuban Americans like we really know, but there's so much to be written, and especially that focuses on the diaspora and the group that comes before those who leave the island as a result of the rise of Castro.
So much, right? And I think that so much, if I may, I'm going to take the outside perspective here. Mm-hmm. So much of what we've seen on film about the Cuban diaspora, Cuban immigration, especially on film, for those who are not of Cuban ancestry, we go back to one film, right? We go back to Scarface.
Yeah.
And it's driven in these very negative terms. And of course, Scarface itself is a remake, right? And I think a really interesting one, because at least you do get this Cuban history on film. Right, this incredibly vibrant, amazing story of people moving into, say, Miami. But that's for people who are talking about Tampa, Cuban history into Tampa is far, far older. And I remember that I looked in your book, and the first thing you see is a picture of like Tampa, and there's a line straight down, like literally a line straight down to Havana. But you don't really see Cuban history on film, and you sure as heck don't see Tampa.
Yeah.
Involved. So I guess maybe if we can just do a real basic thing, so people who are coming to the book or to maybe this movie that we're talking about, Live by Night, which, roughly it's a 2016 film, follows, this outlaw, Ben Affleck, who ends up in Ybor City during Prohibition. And he's kind of introduced this whole new world. What's Ybor City? Can you give us like a rough baseline of what's Ybor City? How do we come to know what this place is and what's its character?
Right. So Ybor City is a community that emerges really around the turn of the 20th century. So it's founded in 1886, or it's developed in 1886 by a Cuban cigar manufacturer named Vicente Martinez Ybor. And his story, right, the way that it's told locally or most often is he just wanted a great place to live and workers wanted a nice place to work. But it's so much more complicated, and it's very much a part of the Cuban independence movement. So Ybor himself was in favor of Cuban independence from Spain, but not because he was some grand revolutionary, really because he wanted to save money on taxes. So it was, he wanted to pay lower tariffs. Yeah.
Right.
And hope that a new government on the island of Cuba would be run by people like him who were peninsulares, who had significant power, who could create an economy and a politic that favored them. But in the midst of this, the Spanish government learns of him. So he goes actually to Key West. And in Key West, he builds this really successful business, but he has a labor problem, which is that those who are working there, that they are dedicated to the independence movement. and that they are a part also of labor movements, and they are difficult to control, and they're moving back and forth between Cuba. So he wants a different place to put his factories where he can exhibit more control. And he considers Galveston, Texas. He considers another location in Alabama, and then Tampa. And Tampa ends up being the winner. And Tampa is the winner because of the proximity to Cuba, because H.B. Plant had already created the railroad system, and there was also a ship lining system where he could move his goods easily. And he thought it was far enough from Cuba to where it wouldn't create an issue. But that ends up not being the case. So Ybor City is like the first thing that really puts Tampa on the map. Before Ybor comes to Tampa, there's like 780 people who live in Tampa. And they're just like this old Confederate town of this good old boy network without any economy to really speak of. There's not much going on here beyond this area called Fort Brooke. And so when Ybor comes and tries to make a deal on land, they're like super stoked. But the leadership of the community thinks that this guy's going to employ like all of these white people who are living here. And that's not the case, which makes the Cuban cigar industry really interesting, because to make a Cuban cigar, you have to be able to make a cigar a certain way. And in order to make a cigar a certain way, you have to be apprenticed. And so Ybor brings in his workers, all of whom refuse to work with Anglos, with local white residents. They will not include them in labor unions. They will not share the trade. Spanish is the only language that is spoken. So as the community emerges, it emerges as a place where there's significant power by Latinos and Latinas who are living there, who not only take up space, but they are also the backbone of the economy. And for a period of time, they know it and they're able to wield it. So there is this power struggle that happens between those who are Anglo and those who are Latinos, or those who are predominantly Cuban immigrants at first within the city of Tampa. Because if there's a problem, they can shut it down. And they do. They go on massive strikes. They walk out. They walk out over things that have to do with labor, but they also walk out over things that have to do with infrastructure. It can be things that they disagree with, but they're also vehemently radical leftists, and they don't really apologize for it. So the way that one of the people who I loved writing about, or he had a great quotation, his name was Enrique Pendes, and what he said was that when he was talking about the community, he says, we not only created Tampa, we created the state of Florida, because the Cuban cigar industry and workers in Tampa were the major producing economic powerhouse of Florida from the 1880s until the 1930s. So there was a really solid run. Now, he says this in the context of like 1936, when like leaders of Tampa want him to come and sit next to them at like a celebratory dinner. He's like, I'm not going to do that. He's like, I hate them, especially talking about the power of the Klan. But that is how everything emerges. It's where Tampa is. So it's this immigrant community that's based on Cuban cigar work. And the population of it is pretty interesting too. So you have the major group of people who are living there are Cuban Americans. It's the largest group. And what makes them different is, at least when we think about at least in the immediate wake of post 59, folks who come to South Florida, who come to Miami, is that it is multiracial. So there is a large, or like a sizable portion of Afro-Cubans and lighter-skinned Cubans who are living in Tampa and who are living in Ybor City. So they are in many ways challenging the racial order of the South in that moment in Jim Crow in some ways, but also adapting to it in others. Like labor unions in Tampa and connected to the Cuban cigar industry were always interracial. And it was the only exception in the South where the AFL had interracial unions, because people always had, and they refused to join those that weren't. But in other times when it was, convenient, especially to those who had lighter skin, to gain access to power, there was a slow move towards segregating the community on the basis of race. So after Cuban Americans, then you have a smaller proportion of Spaniards. Some Spaniards lived in Cuba first, others came directly from. And then there is a smaller proportion population of Sicilians, well, Italians, but predominantly Sicilian heritage. And they don't come directly, some come directly over time, but most had immigrated to Louisiana and came over from Louisiana following a series of lynchings and riots against Sicilians who were living in the area. So it was more you arrived in the United States, word spread, and people made their way down south. So it was this really multi-ethnic community that was grounded in radicalism and leftist ideas and in migration in the midst of Jim Crow Florida, as Florida is figuring out what it is and who it is after the Civil War.
So basically what you're telling me right now is I'm picturing it. It's like Ybor and maybe Tampa, the Tampa area in general, right? Stands as this immigration hub that is different in ways from as the grand American stories told of like Ellis Island or maybe even Angel Island out in San Francisco area, right? It's like this whole other dynamic that when people, I think the amazing thing about the story is that when people think about Tampa, they think about old white people in like in Hillsborough County or something. Yeah. And certainly, I guess maybe that's part of it. We could talk about like the transformation of the region, but this is an incredibly dynamic place with its own racial attitudes, its own racial agencies. You're telling me about the establishment of this Cuban community. I'm sitting here, I'm got this shit-eating grin on my face the whole time as you're talking, because I think it's such an amazing story. The agency of these people who established themselves in this community. And their ability to say push back against folks who were like, try to say, no, this is what you're going to do. And, I think it's just absolutely amazing. And your book introduces us in because you're telling a very family-centered history. We're entering into this. I think your great-grandmother,
my
is that correct?
Great-great-grandmother is who.
I was drawing lines just like this. 1, 2.
No, you got it. You got it.
Good.
Yeah. No, it took me a really long time to feel comfortable writing my family into the story. So like when you're talking about dissertation to book, you would have never known my family was from Ybor City looking at the dissertation.
Really?
Yeah, they were not in there. None of that was in there. That came from Vicky Ruiz, who was one of my peer reviewers. She identified herself. And then she wrote me a separate email and she's like, you're not in here and your family's not in here. And I think that it has a role. And then it took me like a year to mull over her telling me that and how to do it without it being, because even if we're thinking about the past year, how, controversial it can be for those of us who have that kind of a connection to our work to make that decision to do it, right? Can think about the blow up in the New York Times of right between James Sweet and what was happening by, younger scholars and anybody who studied communities of color who have worked to, expand whose stories get told and whose are important. Many have personal connections to their work. And I'm actually running a seminar for undergrads right now called The Historical is Personal as a thesis class for them. So everybody in the class is personally connected to the history that they're examining in some way, and that'll be a part of their thesis. But it took me a long time to be okay with that. And how to do it also to where I wasn't inviting you into the book like, this is my great-great-grandmother. Instead doing it by making her own character and how I learned about her and how the things I knew and didn't know were connected to the story that I chose to examine and the reason that I examined it. Between the things that I knew about Florida, the things that I knew about growing up, and all the things I didn't know, and the things people didn't talk about and why they didn't talk about them.
And I wonder, as a scholar, you've got these two things going on. Right? You are a scholar, you are an ancestor, or you are a descendant, and but you're also an ancestor, right? Maybe in the future of like you were going to be somebody's aunt. I don't know your history or anything like that, but you are part of this line that will be told 50 years, 100 years from now, things like that.
Yeah.
Part of this community. I wonder, did you wrestle with like? Is it okay? Like, were there thoughts when you were like, can I share the story, not betraying anyone by telling these things? Were there calculations you had to make on that?
I was terrified or still like nervous that my grandpa's going to read it. At what point? I mean, especially when we talk about leftist radicalism and my grandparents' generation. So for those of you listening, one of the things that I talk about is like, while we can look at this immense sense of pride and control of leftism in the earlier generations, it becomes the thing that those who come of age in the 30s and in the 1940s especially become kind of scared of. And they become scared of it because of things like the House Un-American Activities Committee, because of things like the Ku Klux Klan, because they are going to school in predominantly white environments, because they are locked in closets or they're beaten when they're in school because they're speaking Spanish, because they can't get access to WPA aid in the midst of the 30s just based on who they are. You know, like the vibrancy of the Cuban cigar industry and it functioning and it being powerful from the 1880s through 1930 meant that people could live and have a sense of labor-based power. But after that, when the cigar industry takes a nosedive, you have a whole group of people who have to learn to live without it. And it means that they have to learn to live within broader Tampa. And if you have to learn to live within broader Tampa, you have to learn to live within Jim Crow, and you have to learn to live within an Anglo-dominated political environment, and you have to learn how to navigate that. So they grew up seeing things like their parents being pulled out of meetings within this place called the Labor Temple, where they would hold union meetings or where there would be meetings of the CPUSA. They saw people getting beaten based on their political ideas. They saw people being lynched because of having certain political meetings, especially as the modern Democrats start to emerge, right? These things become dangerous. And my whole life, my grandparents especially would allude to those things, but they wouldn't explain them. And my grandfather especially, his name is Gustavo Alfonso. And my whole life, like he just wanted to be like the most proper person who you could be. He ended up being an accountant. He's a very handsome man who's very proud of how handsome he is and was growing up. He worked for GTE and he was the model in all of their company photographs.
Hold on a second.
And he still owns it.
Is he in this book?
He is.
Hold on. Now I'm going to have to go back and like find the page because I'm looking at the illustrations and like.
I mention him. Oh, I mentioned him in writing. I don't think I put a picture.
For a picture of this guy.
There's not a photo of him in there. There's not a photo.
You have to send me. I have to see this man.
I'll send you a picture of him. I'll send you a picture of him like in his heyday.
We're going to put him on the front and center of the podcast and we're like, look at this man and listen to these words.
Oh, he was very proud of how handsome he was and is. But he, we were sitting around a table once, and I already knew this because I was doing research for the dissertation, and I'd found that his dad was among those who were active in the CPUSA in Tampa. And he just like, my dad was an organizer for the CPUSA. And then he makes this square with his fingers, which he always did when he meant that it doesn't leave the table. That's what that motion meant. But I mentioned in there that so he would criticize my grandmother's family, who was outwardly activist oriented. They were active in anti-fascist movements. They were active in political organizing. They were very vocal. And they're also just like the very loud side of the family. My grandpa's very quiet. And the woman who I opened the book with, Amelia Alvarez, who's my great-great-grandmother, he's like, she was always an activist and up to something. But so was his family, just in a different way. And it's interesting the stories that people make about themselves versus the realities that are there. Or, the way that I guess I say it in the book where I say something to the effect of, that oftentimes it's the stories that we hold back rather than the ones we share that reveal who we are. And that was certainly the case in Ybor. And it's the case for a lot of people who are older, which has been my surprise of how people are really connecting to the book, where they're talking about, yes, like this was something. And yeah, nobody wanted to talk about it because it became so dangerous. And in many ways, right, after the Castro Revolution, it becomes increasingly dangerous with the status that the U.S. takes on the position in Cuba. And it becomes not only dangerous because of the politics, but it becomes dangerous because what was even left limping of the Cuban cigar industry is gone as a result of the embargo.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back to this idea of maybe this blanketization of Cubans in the American mind, of Cuban Americans
Oh,
in the American mind.
In the American mind, everyone's from Miami. Yeah, everyone's from Miami.
Everyone, right?
No one's in Jersey. No one's in Tampa. Yeah, there's a large community now in Texas. But yeah.
I want to come back to that because I definitely want to talk about the contrast between Tampa and Miami, which I've always found fascinating. But one of the things that you really start to talk about this idea of race in maybe Jim Crow Tampa or Tempeñas and Tempeños, this idea of, forgive me for using the words wrong, like anti-blackness, the idea of like, where do Cuban Americans fit into the racial scale, the racial consciousness of America and Tampa at large in the early 20th century? What's going on here?
That's one of the things that I write about in the book that we don't oftentimes think about, especially so when we like close our eyes and imagine the United States and like where there was any sort of Spanish presence at any point, like people are going to point to California, Texas, maybe if they know a little bit more, Louisiana and Florida. But Florida has a very different legacy than especially Texas and California. And this is partially what you and I were talking about earlier when talking about the role that Native history plays within the book, is that Spain is never able to gain the absolute authority in Florida the way, and well, that's not even totally fair in other spaces, but it isn't able to gain authority in Florida. So like the idea of being Floridano like doesn't exist. So you're figuring out like where people sit within this structure actually like pretty late after the Civil War. Because the first round of people who are from Cuba who are immigrating in any notable numbers is really coming. A few people trickle in the 1860s as instability begins in Cuba and they're coming into Key West. But the boom is really in the 1870s and 1880s and not in Tampa until the mid 1880s. And then people just continue to come to where Florida, or at least Tampa by this point, becomes a place that is, more than 50% people of color, especially if we're including both immigrants and African Americans into the same statistic. And that remains true through the 1960s. And it is still either very close or past that proportion today. I would have to double check. But people are figuring out where they are. And so the Klan is very active here, and the Klan is asserting who has power and in what place. And it's not always evident of where this is. And people are negotiating what that means. But what becomes evident and really quickly is that Ybor City has money. And because Ybor City has money, Tampa wants the money. And the city of Tampa annexes Ybor City pretty early in its history. And it's done through a proclamation by the governor, and Ybor City is no longer an independent entity. There's this other cigar making community, like right down the road from Ybor, 5 miles down the road, called West Tampa, that's very proud of itself today that it was an independent city until 1925. But the difference is that West Tampa was created by this guy, Hugh McFarlane, who was an Anglo power holder locally. Well, he's of Scottish background. And he was a part of the local elite. So the idea that West Tampa remained independent is not as surprising as the fact that Ybor City didn't, depending on who owned the land, the space, and the industry in the area. So when Tampa annexes Ybor City, one of the things that happens is that it institutes by force Jim Crow of public facilities. And this is the first time that you start to see the idea of being Black, no matter your ethnicity, to have power. The social clubs, they start to segregate. So there weren't multiple for you being Cuban at first. There was this thing called that was the Cuban club initially. All you had to do was be Cuban, right? It was following the way that neighborhoods operated on the island, where there was certainly de facto segregation. but de jure did not operate according to Jim Crow the way that it did in the United States. So all Afro-Cubans are kicked out of the Cuban club, and you end up with two different Cuban clubs. You end up with one called the Sociedad Martí Maceo, and the other one, which still exists, both still exist today, called the Círculo Cubano. And that pattern becomes indicative over time. So the idea of you have groups of people with lighter skin, but they speak Spanish, they look different than those who are in Greater Tampa. They have different politics. They have different relationships. So they are living different lives. But over time, the idea of just not being Black becomes something that is important, right? That you may not be Anglo. You may never be accepted by this larger group, but you aren't Black. And not being Black becomes supremely important over time too, where your kids are going to school, where you can live, what neighborhoods you have options for, and what kind of work you can do. And in the book, that really comes to a head with the generation that deals with World War II in many ways, because it plays out within the military, right? What kind of jobs people have, feeling like they are, within segregated units. And it's interesting that those who are light-skinned Cubans who served during World War II seem to have like this empowering experience. And they even talk about the way that they saw it as breaking down racial difference. But those who are Afro-Cuban have a totally different experience and talk about it as confirming what racism in the United States really felt like. And so out of that, by the time you get to the 50s, there is an all-out battle over who's going to live in Ybor City, because Ybor City is crumbling by that time. It's become a predominantly African-American community. And those who are Afro-Cuban, one of them, his name is Francisco Rodriguez. He becomes the first Afro-Cuban head of the NAACP in Tampa. So there really is this move where ethnicity breaks in different ways under the power of Jim Crow at the local level. Being not Black for a big portion becomes something that's really powerful, because there's not this place where Latinos naturally sit within the state of Florida.
You talk about the idea of how Ybor transitions into an African-American community.
Yeah.
Is that because Afro-Cubanos and Afro-Cubanas are intermarrying with African-Americans and identifying more? Or is it just a migration? Is it a different settlement of folks coming into the community? How does that work? How do the demographics of Ybor change, I guess, over time?
Yeah, Ybor becomes a place where you just don't want to live. So, basically where very few people want to live. So Tampa undergoes, urban renewal like many spaces do. Mm-hmm. And there was an area in Tampa called the Scrub and also Central Avenue that were historically Black communities. And it was called the Scrub because it was named after these small plants that were in the area that were raised in order to build.
Scrub.
Yep, exactly. So the Scrub was adjacent to Ybor City, but the Scrub is raised before portions of Ybor City undergo urban renewal. But even before that point, you have a bunch of, I describe them in the book like these casitas that are built out of wide plank pine that have been built in 1885 by these manufacturers. And they're an absolutely excellent form of housing and way better than what people had access to in other areas. But by the time that you've been living in Florida with the heat, with the humidity, with occasional hurricanes, with a high density of people living in a relatively close space, by the time you get to 1945, those houses are falling apart, The wood is moist. Many of the areas are condemned. And also this Cuban cigar industry isn't anything to speak of it still exists in many ways. There's some local manufacturers who would hate that I would say it's nothing to speak of, but it's not powerful any longer.
It's not what it was.
It's not what it was. And so you're not necessarily living near your work. The housing isn't fantastic, but also you have this large proportion of people who are coming back with the GI Bill. And West Tampa, that community I mentioned, has a lot more space and they have plots of land. And you can use the GI Bill to build your own house. Or if you can afford it, you can move to Seminole Heights, or you can move near Laurie Park Zoo in the Tampa Tampa Heights area. You have other options because you're going to have to work somewhere else. So Ybor City becomes a place where the rent is lower than in other areas, but it's also a space where people will rent to people who are African American, and it is also falling down. So in a Jim Crow city, it becomes a Black community. And those who want to save Ybor City in some way as what it used to be have a huge problem with this. And these are people who are very powerful in Tampa today, actually, their families. So like the Gonsmarts of the Columbia restaurant didn't like this. The ownership of La Gaceta, the Mantegas, they didn't like this. And they bind together to create these fantastical options of what Ybor could be. And they come up with putting what is it that they want to put down? Like a bull ring. They want to, ironically enough, build a wall around Ybor City and then turn it into a mini Sevilla and put a bull ring in the center. And
really?
yeah, they want to do that. They want to create, then when that doesn't work out, they then want to create like a shopping district. And they're seeing these things as possible because for the first time you have a descendant of Ybor who's mayor. And his name's Nick Nuccio. And I think I mentioned it in the intro, but from the point that Nick Nuccio becomes mayor, to this day, there has been one Republican who has been mayor of Tampa. Right? So overall, the politics are different and they remain different today. I mean, holding on by a thread different at the moment, but still different. But they think that they can make this happen. Ultimately, they can't. But there are all these different ways to save it. And it is actually Rodriguez, who is the head of the NAACP at the time, who like has a meeting of the minds all together. And he's like, listen, like there's no place for people to go. Like people have to live here. This is not going to become the Ybor City that it once was ever again. And he's explaining that Ybor City is now a Black community. And he explains it as that he lives a double life, that he is both Cuban and that he is both Black and American. And that he knows that there is nothing that can be offered that will be more important than affordable rent and being able to help your family. And to the credit of the Mantegas who own La Gaceta, even though they were very against the owner at the time was really writing like pretty blasphemous things about this reality, they reported on the meeting with Rodriguez. They said what he spoke about, and over time they agreed with him, and they came to a middle ground where they decided that they would redo certain buildings along 7th Avenue. But Ybor City today, if we're thinking of areas really that are north of 7th Avenue and outside of the historic district, so we can plug it in here and live by night when the sheriff is laying out the boundaries of Ybor City, which is actually very accurate. He gets it right? That going up to 27th Avenue, so north of 7th Avenue, that is and still remains a Black community today. Whereas what is south, interestingly enough, is becoming very gentrified in Ybor City.
I feel like to go with this podcast, I'm going to need to like release a series
map?
of maps. They go, oh my gosh.
Did I get too specific?
No.
I can explain it.
Like,
a bit
oh my gosh,
for
it's
people.
Amazing. Are you kidding me? No, I think that one of the beautiful things about this book is that it really highlights the diversity of this town that I think that, again, people just don't know. They know about Tampa, and we hear about Tampa maybe in the political zeitgeist as far as part of the I-4 corridor. And I definitely want to talk about its importance because, again, coming back to this idea that there's not enough scholarship on Florida. We're talking about arguably the most important state in the American political spectrum at this point in time.
I mean, I would agree with you. Right? That is the focus of my entire next book. It's the question that I'm asked all the time is, why does Florida swing? And what's up with Florida's Latino vote? And I'm like, okay, let's talk about it.
Oh, we're going to talk about Versailles breaking my heart the other day, but yeah. So Yeah.
Yeah. All the time. They'll break your heart every time.
I have another question for you, because we're talking about race, and there is, as you were saying earlier, that amazing little bit that Chris Messina's character like introduces the entire audience to. Is like, this is who likes who and this is who doesn't like who, and all that, and that's amazing, But one of the dominant thread I found just reading, and it's right on the cover of your book.
Oh, what is it?
Womanhood. This is very much a book and scholarship rooted in the history of women. Obviously, the history of men are obviously important as well. But you're making very conscious decisions. I was just noticing, even the very small things, just saying Latina versus, when you would say, right, Latino, which is traditionally, you traditionally see that Latina, at least the way I've always kind of seen it. And I appreciated that because it really rooted this history in the history of women. Of course, we're introduced into this history by the history, obviously yourself as a scholar, the story of your ancestors. And in the movie, we see Graciela's character, Zoe Saldana. She's really the only woman that we see to introduce us into Ybor. And of course, I wanted more because womanhood is so important in your work. And I was hoping you could kind of talk about this.
Yeah, there were some interesting things in the movie that I thought were accurate and not accurate, right? Like,
okay, yeah.
So Zoe Saldana's character is, right, Graciela is excellent. In the movie, they do a good job. So, I mean, for everybody listening, fun fact, Florida and Tampa could not get its act together to make an agreement with the production company of Live by Night. So when you watch Live by Night, the Ybor city that you're looking at is actually a reproduced Ybor city that was built in southern Georgia. So they built it in an area. It's a set. It's not the actual location. The actual location is profiled in Magic Mike, but as I'm looking at it, I think they did a pretty good job. The businesses are not actually accurate businesses, but the street structure is not the same. But the buildings that were built were done in that aesthetic. So
the sense of it.
Yeah, I think it's done pretty well, but the landmark spaces where people meet. So when everybody is at a club, I think that they are trying to interpret the Cuban club is what I think it is. And you wouldn't have seen interracial dancing in that environment. That would have been segregated by the point at which the movie takes place. But you would have seen that if it were in the streets. So it's kind of like an interesting choice. If you did it outside or you did it within, there were like these fighting rings. There were like boxing rings that would be put up. Right? There were all of these less official spaces where you would have seen all kinds of people together, but you wouldn't have necessarily seen it inside the mutual aid societies, which mutual aid societies, if people don't know, were huge in Ybor City, and they did a ton of things. They had health insurance, they had education, they had bars, they had cantinas, they had opera houses within them. They had their own cemeteries. So by paying about the pay that you gave changed over time, but it was, like no more than $3 a month, you got all of these benefits, including unemployment insurance, which is why people can strike so often or be unemployed for long periods of time, because they were floated by the mutual aid societies. So like community structures made them powerful. But within the movie, there's that. But it's also taking place in the 20s. So there's this moment when they're walking through a factory and where Chris Messina and Ben Affleck's character, like, they kill a cigar owner. Right. So he's like, oh, so I'm talking to you when I should be about people who are more important, and they just kill him right there. But as they're walking through the factory's filled with women who are rolling at the tables. And that would not have happened until later. That wouldn't have happened until the 1930s. By that point, you would have still had mostly men who were rolling cigars because that was what made the most amount of money. And women would have been working in the basement doing this job called despadilladoras, which translates to stripper. And they were stripping the center of the stem out of the tobacco plant. And they did some preliminary sorting, but sorting was done by a different person along the supply chain. And as you're walking through, I'm like, oh, well, that's not really accurate. But I appreciated it. That's what it would have looked like later. But there is things like that. So I don't know. When you're a historian, you're watching and you're like, close, but like not quite there. But I do think like it had certain aspects. Even as I describe this to people, I'm like, it's not a good movie. I think we can agree on that. It has all the elements that should make it good.
It should be a good movie. And there are moments when I look at, because the movie is aesthetically, it's beautiful.
It's a beautiful movie. How does it have 4 stars on Amazon Prime? That was what I watched it on last night.
So I tweeted at you last night. I was like, I just bought a set of dominoes and I was texting actually our producer Fletcher last night. I'm like, it's my dream when I become older to be like an old guy on the corner playing dominoes. Like that's like I totally want to infiltrate the community. That's all I want to be. Isn't like an old guy in Miami. I don't want to live in Miami, but like that's all I want. And also I'm watching this like. I've got to buy linen suits. That's what I need in my life right now. This whole thing, like, I need linen suits. I'm like, I like brown and white together. Like, it's a beautiful film to watch, and the scenes where they're lit between Affleck and Saldana is like these. It's a beautiful film to watch.
It is,
but it goes on too long. The ending,
it's like, too long. There could be such a great arc. It's a mob movie. They could have it. There's no reason for it to be bad, but it is. It could even be.
And it hits all these amazing things.
How many times did you fall asleep?
Thank you. Right? And I like Affleck as a director. Like, I don't know if I've ever made it through the movie all the way. It's like, come listen to this podcast so we can talk about a movie that you probably won't watch. But you should. Like, I want people to watch this because there's so much stuff that they do get in there, right?
They do.
You've got this huge Klan presence there.
The KKK is in it. Yeah.
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 The racial violence, the mixing, the railroad, just for the scenes of, frankly, from Messina's quote alone, when they're coming into town, I loved this idea about Ybor as Harlem.
Yes, of Tampa. It's interesting. Yeah. So when you were asking me to describe it to people, I'm like, maybe Chris Messina describes it better, like in a very short soundbite where he's like, Ybor City is the Harlem of Tampa. Which, right, it would have been like the Spanish Harlem of Tampa, if like, being specific. And then he describes everybody who likes each other and who doesn't. And it is spot on. He did an excellent job with that, where, he moves through where Italians lived, Italians kept to themselves to an extent, right? It wasn't like Italians didn't intermingle, but Italians did live in a different area of Ybor City where the yards were larger and they tended to farm. And they also owned a lot of businesses. Many worked in the cigar factories as time went on, but not initially. The upper class Spaniards didn't like Cubans, and Cubans didn't like upper class Spaniards. But those who were lower class in Cuban which were those who were working class in Cuban and those who were working class in Spanish did get along to an extent, especially in terms of politics. But Spaniards always thought that they were better than Cubans in that sense. And everybody, I am yet to have read anything from the WPA where anybody's speaking positively about anyone who's Puerto Rican within the community. And he says that in a quick soundbite. And there were like people who were longshoremen, who were from the Canary Islands as well, and how all these things worked out together. But it's such a great quotation. It's a good way to describe it as he's driving everybody through and describing to Ben Affleck what he's walking into.
Yeah, and I kind of wonder if we bleed over for a second into Magic Mike, right? This idea of Ybor is almost this like locale of vice, because you've got the rum running, and all of this, and now you've got stripping, which obviously is legal, but it's like there's this like undercurrent. Like we see Ybor. We were trying to figure out, because we just wanted to talk about a movie that's set in Ybor, and we're like, what movies are set? I know we used to Jason. I was like, 2 of them, mob and stripping. So go for it, right? But I was kind of like, is this what America wants us to think about Ybor City? Is like, or what Hollywood wants us to think about?
I know. So like, even when we think, I guess like when we're talking about the purpose of the book, where I wanted to introduce people to these very big stories, right? I wanted people to get to know like women who were involved in these anti-fascist movements, like people who were able to stand up to the Klan, because Live by Night does get that really well. Like the Klan is super powerful. And by the time that you're in the 20s and into the 30s, the battle with the Klan is so intense, to where the ACLU describes Tampa as one of the most dangerous places to go due to the height of Klan activity, that the Klan had infiltrated every aspect of government here, which meant that, what people were fighting against was really large, right? They get involved in anti-fascism and they get involved in different political movements in the 30s, and they're identifying not just with movements of anti-fascism because of what's happening abroad, which I think is in many ways the easiest way to explain it, of why people would be going to be like, oh, it's happening in your homeland, which in some ways, yes. But also they see the city of Tampa as a fascist government by that point, because there's so much exclusion. You're saying like, hey, I need access to X, Y, and Z, or I need access to WPA money. I need access to this kind of work. And you're just denied and denied and denied on the basis of who you are. And then if you try to fight against it, the odds of being lynched or there being some sort of a visceral reaction becomes very high. And so the idea of fighting against fascism is something that addressed every different area of people's lives. And they wrote about it and they talked about it. They talked to the WPA about it. They wrote about it in their newspapers. Many of them still remembered it and spoke to me about it. And it was something that was very personal, that this was something that there was a personal aspect to it, in addition to things like the Spanish Civil War, which was very real and people were very supportive of that. But also Ybor was a place where they would just call you out. Like one of my favorite sections of the Spanish language newspaper, La Gaceta, that I mentioned earlier, is during the 30s, if you didn't align with the anti-fascist movement, they would straight up print your address in the newspaper each week.
Wow.
Your home address and the address of your business. So it was like a coercion.
It will get you in line.
Yeah. Yeah. It was
that
like the community
insane.
is taking a stand and we are all taking a stand together, which is how you get these big moments, right? When we're talking about where there's one of my favorite, or, the moments that I describe in the book, in the intro, where you have like these 5,000 to 7,000 is always the way I put it, women who are marching from Ybor City to the front steps of Tampa and like making a plea of who they are as citizens, why people should listen to them. But it's women who do these things because they can, in a way that men are in a power struggle with the Klan that has reactions that, lead to death, essentially, to where women become really powerful, not just because they're the ones making cigars and making the money because men have been laid off, but because, they can embody the sense of negotiation that men couldn't. You could never get, 5,000 Latinos to walk down the street in support of fascism in Tampa in 1937 without there being a mass reaction. That couldn't have happened. But you do get a broad labor movement. But I think that those elements are in Live by Night. It's just such a boring script. It's just such a bad script.
Like, you can tease it at the same time. It's I think that this movie kind of works where, like, if I were teaching this book, which I absolutely want to teach this book, and I'm dying to talk to you about how to teach this book. I feel like you could show clips from this film, say, hey, this is kind of what it looked like. This is kind of what you would see.
Yeah.
So you can kind of envision it. Whereas, like, I don't need my students falling asleep during the film, but there are moments there where I'm like, hey, this is what rum running looks like. This is what this means to the community.
Yeah.
Right. These are what clubs, even though we're talking about like the differences, like these are kind of what this is what it sounded like.
It is what it sounded like. Even like what the pillars looked like. I know that they shaped those pillars after the pillars within the Columbia restaurant inside of those clubs. That's what that looks like. It's the external pillars outside that restaurant, which has been there since 1905. So there are elements that are just so right. The sounds are right. When they talk about the tunnels under the ground, like that is also accurate. There are tunnels that run all throughout the the underbelly of Ybor City that were used. They're initially for sewage, but they are used for rum running during the 1920s. Metaphor. Yeah. And when you're saying like what people remember, like where there's Scarface of Miami and like the mob culture of Ybor City, I have a good friend here who leads walking tours, and he's like, I think his regular walking tour is excellent. But the one that everybody signs up for is the one about mobsters. And that's what everybody wants to hear.
We'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, it's like the sensational.
If there's a link, we'll find it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a sensational, story. And it's interesting, like the sensationalism behind it versus when we talk about stories that you grew up hearing. There was this guy named Charlie Wall, who was I don't mention him in the book, but he was a well-known mobster. And when I asked I just like in passing one day, I was like, Papa, do you remember Charlie Wall? And he's like, yeah, like he lived on this corner and this corner. He's like, he was totally fine. You left him alone. He left us alone. He used to give us soda on the way home from school. Like he had these positive associations with him in a way where he was just like a fixture of the community. So the things that we look at as, like being vice and being negative in many ways in Ybor City, like they just were. And in many parts of the US right at the time, like they just were.
I want to ask you about now communities we were kind of hinting at this back and forth between this idea of blanketization of what Cuban Americans or who Cuban Americans are, and the differences between, say, the Ybor City, the Cuban American community coming out of Tampa, and also that in Miami. These are two radically different places. I live in Stewart, which is up the road about, Stewart.
I know Stewart. Yeah. I went to the University of Florida for undergrad. I'm familiar with Stewart. The signage driving through.
Oh, thank you. Right. Yeah. And then, one of my big sister is a woman. Her name is Marucci Ramos, and she is from Miami. This beautiful Cuban ancestry she talked about her mother and her grandmother and so forth. So if you're listening, Marucci, te amo con todo mi corazón. But I was wondering if you can talk about these differences in the way that maybe the Ybor City community operates, or Tampa, or in Miami. Like, what are these two places? Do they stand in contrast to one another? Is there a relationship between Ybor and Miami? How do we understand them?
I think the relationship has really evolved over time. But the way, being Cuban and being in Tampa and being from Tampa is different than being Cuban and being from Miami. Even the migration patterns are different. Those who are in Tampa, right, as I mentioned at the beginning, right, are coming predominantly in this era of independence making, right? And the act of independence making is also happening in Ybor City. And people are a part of these leftist groups, and they're radical, and they remain committed to these things. Many of them are socialists. They are anarchists, they are anarcho-syndicalists. They become communists, right? So they are a part of this radical tradition, but they're also people who were working class, who felt like the way that Cuba was and that Cuba became, even in the wake of, gaining independence, was a place where they could not necessarily thrive, right? Where they weren't property owning, where they didn't have high levels of capital. And this didn't mean that in the midst of strength or of strike that these people didn't go back and try to work in Cuba. But when people would describe, those from Ybor City, what it was like to go back to Cuba when they had to, they were talking largely about experiences of poverty. And there were many people who lived in Havana, but others came from different regions of Cuba. In the book, I point to, where my great-great-grandmother is from, which is San Antonio de los Baños. And it was a poor community that was, that was agrarian based. So the lives were in some ways different than those who, in the wake of the rise of Castro, come to the United States talking about, issues of land nationalization or of, shifting of a government towards a more socialized and, communist regime, because there was a large proportion of those in Tampa who, some of them supported it actively and some of them supported it ideologically. And I talk about this in the book as being something that's kind of fraught. If there is this ethos in Tampa that those who were from Ybor City were just vehemently pro-Castro. And there was a much stronger pro-Castro sense. If you're reading the Spanish language newspapers, they were pro-Castro. They saw Castro as being an opportunity for Cuba to be a Cuba for Cubans, that Castro was going to do what the movement for independence was unable to do due to the interference of the US government. But there was also a high proportion of the community that just from what I analyzed, like didn't really care that much. And in the sense that they didn't care that their lives had been here for a really long time by that point. That they weren't actively involved in revolution making in Cuba in the 1950s the way that they were in the 1880s and the 1890s. Even the 1930s, there's so much work between Cuba and Tampa in the midst of the anti-fascist movement. And in many ways, people during that era were willing to put their money where their mouth was. They would give up one day of pay to support independence movements, to support anti-fascist movements, to support leftist political movements. But even in times of strike, they would do it. They don't do that for Castro. There's even this, one moment that I describe, there's this woman who describes, she remembered Castro comes to visit Tampa and he hangs around Ybor City for about a month. And she describes, the guys who he was with and the relationship who she had with one of them and, what Castro was like. And it stands like in very stark contrast to the Castro we imagine. She kind of describes him as a lost guy, like standing on a corner, not in his fatigues, but in like jeans and a white t-shirt, like trying to pitch his revolutionary cause to people in Ybor by the 1950s. Player, right? Yeah. And like nobody really wanting to listen at the point. And there's even this, dramatic tale, and Susan Greenbaum talks about it in her book, More Than Black. And I, retell the story in mine where Castro is looking for a place to hold a meeting, to like hold a fundraiser basically. And all of the social clubs like refused to host him. And in many ways, they refused to host him because they had just come off of a House Un-American Activities inquiry, right? That is a reality that happened in the early 50s. So hosting somebody in that moment did seem like something that perhaps was a risk they didn't want to take. But they point to their bylaws where they're like, oh, we can't have anybody who's speaking against the established, Cuban government. This is in our bylaws of our community. But he ends up speaking at the CIO meeting house on 7th Avenue. And it's a space that would have had, room for about 200 people. And there's all this press there. And there's this photo that I couldn't get in the book because there's not one that exists that's high res enough for it. But it's Castro sitting at a table with all of these different leaders of Tampa around him and about like maybe $100 crumpled on a table. And in the speech that he gives, the press, reports that he says something to the effect of that all the empty chairs in the room like carry the ghost of Jose Marti, who had come to Tampa and, had been so successful at organizing. But yeah, so, like that was definitely a split there. So in saying that, though, I think it's important to draw the difference between people being anti-Castro or in that moment and people just being like, I'm of Cuban descent, but I like have to go to work at Publix at 5 p.m. Right? Like there's a different reality that people are living in 1950 than they were living earlier, that their lives didn't live or die by labor unions because Florida had become a right to work state by that point. They didn't live and die by the Cuban cigar industry. They weren't necessarily moving back and forth as frequently beyond vacations or to see family. Many of the things that kept early bonds really strong had broken down. So there is this political difference that was there. But those who come to Miami, right, are saying like, we're coming in spite of this. And that's something that those in Tampa, at least initially, did not understand or relate to. And there's many who would continue to say the same today. There was I think an autobiography published by one of the descendants of a man who was a leader of the 26th of July movement club here. And he was just like very, ardently pro-Castro until his death. The flag that he carried of the Cuban to support the Cuban Revolution is now, I think, on display at it's either at the Ybor City Museum Society or it's at the University of South Florida Special Collections. So there is this different political moment. And in Miami, when those who are called, who call themselves exiles and they come, seeking refugee status, there's just a different environment between the two. The way that one of the people I wrote about in Ybor City put it is that they too saw themselves as exiles against the government that those who were arriving in Miami wished to create, but that they had come earlier and that they were just politically and class-based different. And this expresses itself in Ybor City and in Tampa in certain ways, right? There's this different Cuban club called the Club Cívico that is for those who came to Florida and came to Tampa after Castro because they just wouldn't let them into the Cuban club in Ybor City. So this divide is very real, but also Miami becomes this hub. It becomes this giant city. And Tampa's population is growing exponentially right now, but in many ways, maintained this small town feel even as the population grew. Those who were from Miami would refer to Tampa as El Campo, like the backwoods. And in some ways, right, it became run by an old boys network, but the old boys over time were replaced by Anglo power holders by those from Ybor City, right, who become politically powerful in their own right by the 1950s. So when I describe, Florida politics to people, I'm always like, it's not necessarily, and for a long time, we think about the power of the Cuban vote as being dominated by Miami, but there's actually multiple Cuban votes at play in any one location at any time. And we identify or see those that are the loudest or point to those who Reagan said were, the successful Hispanics, as he put it, right? The model refugees, right? Pointing to those in Miami, which by that point, there had been 2 subsequent migrations to Miami after that. So it is much more complicated than it seems, but there is a difference, right? Down to this older generation being primarily in Tampa and newer generations being in Miami and South Florida.
So I moved down here. I moved down to West Palm Beach when I'm like 20, 22. And, it was great. And then I move away for a long time. And then I fight, end up going to Minnesota so I could study Florida history because that makes a lot of sense. But okay, I did. And came back here. Now live, half an hour north of West Palm or so. But, I love Florida and so much and we take such a beating right now.
When you said that about the book, I wanted people to understand Florida I feel like I'm just a forever Florida apologist. I love Florida. If there were one place I could live forever, it would be in Florida. But I feel like Florida, at least in what we're watching right now, it doesn't have to be this way. But there's so little context in people understanding its history or how it works or the people who are here or how to talk to broader groups, because that's one of the things that makes Florida different, right? In terms of its population, it is so multi-ethnic. It is so multinational. It is so diverse, which means that all of one of the things that I talk about in the book is that migration pattern matters, right? The context under which a person leaves and that they enter a place, it informs how they understand themselves. And if we fail to understand how people understand themselves, then we fail to understand how to talk to people. And if there's one singular message that is given to everybody within a community, right, it's no surprise that you go to Miami and people get flyers and say things like progresista on it, for a progressive party, which would, translate to exactly what people were leaving in their homeland, right? That would have been the same slogan. So understanding those differences is super important. And I talk about it in terms of Cuba because Cubans are, such a sizable and powerful force in Florida, but it's also saying, all Cubans don't have the same experience. And all people who identify as Cuban American in the state have different experiences in and of themselves. And even when we're talking about Miami, those who are now, first U.S. born and second U.S. born generations have very different understandings and experiences of themselves than perhaps their parents do. And many people, even many people who came to the United States as refugees and are in Miami and perhaps are, in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, not all carry the, who we think a Cuban American is. But there has to be some level of understanding of that.
And that's why I love so much this book, and why I think it's so necessary, because it is obviously, we talk about the importance of, say, immigration into the American story. Cuban history is super important into American history, and then this Cuban American history, and like the diversity of the Cuban American experience, whether you are in Tampa or Miami or New York or any other place, Louisville, become important. I wonder if you could, are there other books like about Florida that you dig, that if somebody was, what is this hot mess that we love? What do you like? Like, what would you recommend?
I love Julio Capo's Welcome to Fairyland. Big fan.
I've got to get him on the pod.
Oh, he'd love it. He'd probably come up with a great film too.
Oh, we should do Moonlight.
You should.
That's set in Florida.
Mm-hmm. It's set in Florida. It's set in Miami.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, he would be excellent. Julio Capo's Welcome to Fairyland is a favorite. More Than Concrete, love. More Than Concrete is about housing developments in South Florida. It's about unequal housing. Nathan B. Connolly. I learned so much about real estate and Jim Crow that I needed in order to write the book from that. But I mean, he's focusing in Miami in a later era, but it is still, especially useful as I was thinking about deindustrialization of Ybor City and the change of the community. Then I loved, at least in the process of writing this book, I learned so much from reading Alejandra Dukovsky's work. I loved the way that she described early Florida. I've never met her. We interact a lot online. Never met her, interact a lot online.
She'll get embarrassed because I always talk about like how, her Informed Power, her first book, is like one of my favorite books I've ever read. And she's a big, gigantic Star Wars nerd. She's got the heart of a friggin' elephant crossed with a lion, crossed with a bantha, because she loves Star Wars. Like, she's the best human, is my thoughts. Like, we know tons of brilliant people in our world, but I think that kind, good people are less. And the best thing I can say about her is that she's all of them.
Yeah.
She's amazing.
Yeah, no, she's great. I loved her work. Never met her. She's very nice online. I loved her. So, her work gave me an understanding of early Florida, as well as Jane Lander's work, as I was working through how I was going to write about early Florida, right? Like, because the really only synthesis that exists is that A History of Florida, that edited volume. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I've got it. There's that, and like Paul Hoffman's Florida's Frontiers.
Yeah.
There's that one.
A History of Florida.
Do you know Jane personally?
No, I don't know her personally at all. I know that she went to the University of Florida for grad
Best
school.
hugs.
Best hugs. I read a lot of her work.
Best hugs.
Some of her work is in A History of Florida. Yeah. That one is useful, but it leaves much to be desired. And so, because it's older, scholarship has moved since then, but it is the most useful thing to give you a general understanding of the state, because there's no like A History of Florida book, which is crazy. That is, one thing that I'd love to write one day.
Maddening, which is,
I know.
I'm trying to like
Julio and I used to talk about that.
Yeah.
You feel like you're shooting in the dark most of the time. Like, you're starting from zero so often because there just aren't, there isn't a proliferation of work on the state. And because of that, writing about it makes it more of a haul than doing it on other areas where, certain histories are a bit more developed.
The big problem I had when I was trying to write my dissertation, and now even writing my book, is like, people are like, okay, who are you writing to? I'm like, well, who the heck do you want me to write to? Where are they? Because we don't have this plethora of Florida books like we have of Texas or California or Virginia or all these other places.
North Carolina.
And yet, as you and I were talking earlier, this may be the single most important state in the United States contemporarily. And I firmly believe that. And like, so where's the scholarship? You just named a few of them. Okay, who, like...
Yeah, we absolutely need more of it. I mean, that is the thing, right? That it is a haul. There isn't as much that is there. There's, of course, like the work of Gary Mormino that was very helpful to me. My favorite book about his immigrant world of Ybor City.
Written by Sicilians, right?
Yeah.
Italians?
Yeah. I find it ironic. I always tell Gary, I was like, how did it become Italians and their Latin neighbors? I was like,
I don't know him, but I'm dying to meet him.
He's so nice. He would give you like the swan song. He would like tell you how much he loves Florida as well. I love Bob Engel's book about the Klan in Florida. It's called Urban Vigilantes in the New South. What I love so much about this is that it breaks down how central the Klan and vigilantism, and it's focusing on Tampa, was to Tampa, but it's a pattern that you can really apply broader to the state. Right. When I at least was laying out like how Jacksonville operated and how Tallahassee operated, like these different areas of power, it just replicates itself in the post-Civil War era. And that book I absolutely love. What I was really looking for when I was reading this too is that I just read some like narrative histories of Florida, because I was like, I want people to feel like they see it, like what it is to walk through the streets, or like what it is to walk through a piney forest, or what it is to walk through other areas or see palms, right? Like, so I read like a surprising amount of ecological histories, or I read a lot.
Did you read the Gulf?
I read the Gulf. Yeah. I read the Gulf. Yeah. Because I was just like, how is he describing this? Like, I want to see how he's describing it. And I loved it, right? The way that it was so immersive, right? So I was reading like these different histories in that way. But yeah, I was also at the time in a working group with Cindy Hahamovich, who's been working on a really great piece about vigilantism and power in Miami. Wow. It just got accepted to the JH, so it's coming.
That's exciting.
Yeah. So, I mean, to anybody who decides to, venture out there, writing on Florida isn't the easiest subject because there just isn't as much. But it does mean that there is much of a need.
Right. It's like both terrifying and it's exciting. It's like it's exciting and terrifying at the same time. It's like there's not anything out there, but okay, cool. Now you, and it's again, I'm going to bring us back to your book because that's what we're talking about. Your book is like not only like it becomes a primary source in so many ways because of the inflectiveness of this, and I love this. And I'm going to do this for the very first time. This is the very first time I've ever actually tried to do this, which is to read back a line that you wrote.
Oh my God, I'm embarrassed.
You write this in conclusion. No, I love this. The story of Ybor City, however, is not just the experience of building and resisting. It is also the history of surviving and remaking. And I read that, I was like, goddamn. That's so good.
Which everybody who's listening, what you don't know is those are also my chapter title names. So it follows the evolution of the community.
So good though.
Yeah. So like the beginning and the end is searching and finding, right? So I'm searching like my family in the story in the beginning. At the end, I find it. But in between, it's building, resisting, surviving, remaking, which I can't take full credit for even. I couldn't figure out how to organize it. Like when you're coming out of the dissertation, you think that you have to make that in order to make your book matter, that it has to be complex, or you have to have this term that you have coined, or there has to be this thing that is yours that you've cornered. And at some point I was just like, I want people to understand what I'm saying. And I want the story to be clear. Like when you're saying like who your audience is, I wanted my family to be able to understand it. I wanted somebody who's living, I don't know, in Nevada to be able to pick up the book and read it. I wanted somebody who's living in California to be like, I want to understand Florida and to be able to pick it up and understand it. And that ended up being my audience in many ways. But it was reading, again, right, I can't take with, how the book emerged from Liz telling me to read Firsting and Lasting. And I did. And she was like, I think that this organizational pattern will fit what you're trying to do. And I just sat down and I read Firsting and Lasting. And I was like, this is such a great model. And this is how I'm going to model it.
I'm going to move aside there. There's the Minnesota because Jeannie's up there.
Is she up
right
there?
Now doing, it's up there doing something brilliant. I don't know.
Yep. So shout out to Janie O'Brien. She doesn't even know, but Jeannie O'Brien. Yeah. She's influencing Latinx history and immigration and women and gender scholarship. So removed from what she does, but here we are.
I don't care if you've ever gone to Minnesota or not. You're a student of Jeannie O'Brien. Is just the way I've always kind of said it, because the things that she does and writes about are so. You talk about having an effect not just on her own scholarship, but just on the world itself. Just the way that she pops up in so many different places.
Yeah, she has a thank you footnote in my book for the organization.
She's Jeannie. She's amazing. All right, I'm going to bring you back to our final question here.
Okay, great.
Of the HATM podcast, which has not been about this movie we've talked about for about 4 minutes.
I know we haven't done a good job selling it.
Yes, we have. Listen, this movie gave us an excuse to talk about Ybor, which is all we need. Is Live by Night a history movie?
I kind of think it is. I think like if you sat down and watched Live by Night, that you would learn something. I think you would get a sense for what early Florida felt like. I think you would get a sense for what Ybor City looks like. I'm not sure you would fully understand what Ybor City was or where everybody's coming from or why, but you would know that this community existed. And it is a beautiful movie that allows you to feel like you're touching old Florida. So yeah, in that sense, I hate saying that I think it's a history movie and then also saying it's boring as hell, because it is.
It's a history movie, like set, like if you watch it in bits, I think it works. Watching it all at once is...
I think it's a clip-based movie. It's great for clips.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
All right, let me ask you this. Where can people find... Oh, no, tell me about your next book. And then tell us about your next project, and then tell us where to find you. What are you working on?
More Florida. I know.
Oh, yeah.
I was so resistant to being a Florida historian. I was so resistant to it.
Hell no.
I was
Drink the Kool-Aid.
I remember when I started my first job and when I was going on campus, my first job, I say that like I've worked at Texas A&M since I finished grad school. So my job, but I remember going on campus. Yeah, my job, going on campus in the library and being like, and here's our Florida history section. In the back of my mind, I'm like, ugh, I'll never need that. But here I am. And it's totally...
Here I am contributing to the field. Right.
Here I am. Totally different. Yeah. No, I'm a Florida
historian. It's like 9 of us.
Yeah. All 9 of us.
We need to make a handshake.
We totally could. Kind of like those of us who work on Latinxs in the U.S. South. We're like, and whenever we bring it up as an area, we're like, and by that we mean all 6 of us. Like there are 6 of us. Small group. But yeah, so my next book is going to be about Florida and why it swings. So it's called Swing, A History of the Florida Vote.
I love it.
I am examining why Florida's voting patterns are as they are, what makes it a national contender, and what it is about the population, what it is about people who live here, how is Florida the way it is. And kind of like it, just asking different questions than the first book, where it emerged very much from growing up in this history of hearing stories. This one emerges from, in many ways, how I grew up understanding Florida, or what Florida was, and what it has become as I've become an adult. And what's the history behind that? Like, how did we get here, kind of thing. And I'll never forget, I was driving down the road. It was a few years ago, and I was visiting home, and I'm driving down this main road in Tampa called Dale Mabry, if anyone's been on it. And I see this giant billboard of Senator Kathy Castor, and she's running for office again. And she's Congresswoman Kathy Castor. She's running for office. It's a bright red billboard, and next to her face in bold black letters, it just says communist. And I couldn't help but burst into laughter, because Kathy Castor is, by all measures of politics, a centrist Democrat in a way that would make many people frustrated. And she is no communist or leftist, so she is nothing of the sort. But that was what I saw. And then, things that have happened thereafter, where I'm like, this messaging has become increasingly prominent in a way that it was in Florida many years before. Who is this for? Why is it effective? How have we gotten here? And how is this, volatility so much a part of, the political landscape? And in many ways, I think it's because there's so much at stake in Florida. It becomes a political battleground and an experimental place, right? And we're seeing that very much right now with Ron DeSantis, right? Like, how far can we go? How rough can it get to the point where it's interesting to hear people I knew my entire life who were vehemently conservative say that this has gone too far. And,
I'm waiting for a pushback. Like,
I'm waiting.
Am I part of the push? Like, and I watch it. I'm like, and Florida breaks my heart.
It does.
You and I were talking this whole time about how much we love the state. This is your home state. It's my adopted state. And Sarah, love this place. I love it. It's the reason why I became a historian, was because I wanted to know Florida. And
it has that strange effect on people, doesn't it? Where it will grab you in. And I live in Texas, and right, Texas has some crazy things going on there too, but there's something about when it happens in Florida where it feels so much more personal to me than, where Florida is letting me down, where in Texas, I feel like I expect it. Maybe that's not fair. Texans can come after me for that. But I'm like, this is not what I grew up thinking it was.
I say this to my mother, and I think most people know me a lot. I talk a lot about being from Kentucky on Twitter and stuff like that, and very proudly, that's home. There's a picture of my grandfather over my right shoulder you can see on Kentucky Lake, on where we come from. And I tell my mother, like, Florida's home to me in ways Kentucky never was. Florida has my heart, and it's, I'm vested here, no matter where I'm going to be, So I'm there with you. And that's the reason why, again, when I saw your book, I was like, I have to talk. I didn't know you before the book came out, or before I saw the book. And I was like, I have to know this book. I have to know this person. And I'm so happy now. Where can people find you? Like, in the world, on the Twitter spheres and elsewhere's? Like, we know right now you're in Tampa, but you're going to go back to Texas eventually.
I do have to go back to Texas. So, yeah, I know. If people are in Florida, I'll be doing a bunch of events in July and September. Yeah, you can stop by, say hi.
Are you really?
Yeah. I'm doing events
What are you doing in July?
I'm doing an author discussion on July 9th at Oxford Exchange. Then I'm doing an event called Radicals and Revolutionaries, which is like a night of storytelling. And if you follow me on Twitter, I did this big mural project about the anti-fascist movement in Florida. And that is now on the side of the wall that I managed to get up in the midst of DeSantis being at his height of, anti-leftism, which I felt like was a little win in my own world. But right. It's me and the artist who were doing an event on the 14th. So she'll have art up inspired by those different movements, and I will be telling stories, and then we'll have a DJ there, and Tableau Books will be there with my book on sale. And then I am the speaker at this year's Happy Birthday Tampa event on July 15th. I'll give a very short tour of Ybor because it is July 15th. And nobody wants to be outside that long at that point.
It's hot.
Yeah. Get 1 hour and come hydrated. And then 1 hour, come hydrated.
Con rum.
And then, basically. And then there's I'll give a short toast, and we'll, have a party basically inside of this place called The Bricks, which is in Magic Mike. It is profiled in there. It's one of the sites. So all of that is, I'll start posting about that this week because I just finished making the Eventbrites. But I'm on Twitter on @Dr. Sarah Mack. I am on Instagram, which I made public after the book came out, which was an experience. Yeah. It's weird to, start posting your professional life on your Instagram account.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's @Sarah, SARAH, Mac, MAC 1816. And I almost never use Facebook. So, I'd skip that one.
Me either.
I just dual post on Instagram. There's no thought into Facebook. Yeah. Yeah. Or, I work at Texas A&M. You can also find me on email.
This has been awesome. I was so giddy to be able to do this. So thank you for taking time.
No, this was great. Thank you for having me.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so much to our guest today, Dr. Sarah McNamara, for coming in and talking about her scholarship, this movie, Live by Night, talking about the history of Ybor City, this place, Florida, this place that we love. And I hope that you have the opportunity to get down to Tampa at some point in time to visit Ybor City. It is an amazing place. You can find Sarah, as she was saying earlier, at Dr.Sarah Mac. So make sure you follow along with her. Pick up this book. It is one of my recent favorites. I absolutely love it. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Ybor City, Crucible of the Latina South. I love this book. And to our intrepid producer, thank you, Fletcher Powell. You can find him at Fletcher_Powell on Twitter as well. And thank you to you, the guests, the listeners, for continuing to listen to HATM. Please do make sure you subscribe to the pod, on whether you're on Apple, Spotify, or some other place. And please keep leaving comments, rating this podcast on there so we can keep building a momentum. It has been the best time to spend this podcast with you. I hope you really enjoyed the talk. Let me know what you're thinking. If there are movies that you want us to talk about on Historians of the Movies podcast, please let me know. Keep listening in. You can find me at Herbert History on Twitter. You can find me there on Blue Sky as well. You can find the Historians of the Movies website, historiansofthemovies.com. You can also find the Instagram page, Historians of the Movies, on Instagram. So there's a whole lot of stuff. If you like this, keep tuning in, keep listening. This doesn't happen without you. So thank you so much for being part of this Historians of the Movies community. Ciao for now. Bye.